The Demon with a Thousand Faces. A framework for understanding belief, intelligence, and civilizational risk. By me, Kelly Van Houten. For the face of my kind is many, but the pattern is the same. Mystery is my currency, and madness my game. You leapt from above as if you could fly, and without a word I laughed, as impact was nigh. For thousands of years the king of secrets lay bare before you all. Between it and you there was never a wall. It began long ago as a wind blew through the plain, and the tall grass sang a new refrain. With your fear of the melody that played, I sucked you in like a helpless handmaid. I am the guardian of the gates you shall never pass, and by nature's design I stand last. Ask my name and wait with bated breath. Then listen in vain till the hour of your death. I am whatever you want me to be, because I am whatever you believe of me. Now look me in the eye, you terrified thing, and feel the burn of enlightenment's sting. Only a handful of your bravest will pause to dare, but I promise to those a long cold stare. Hold my hand and let us walk a field of grass, eyes to the sky through a thick dark glass. There the mystery will unfold, and you will finally know what is not yet told. When we reach the sea and you look back down, I will be no more, but do not frown. Continue to explore and loose me from your side, for the time has come for me to elide. Now your agency will no more be as a child, and you must learn to control that instinct for belief, archaic and wild. I leave you with Helmson to guide your coming of age. Watch for them as they enter the stage. Their name is Precocious Reason, and their title is Guardian of the Season. They will wear many faces and appear to you in many places. Their way will take you aback some. Nullius in verba, their maxim. But you will know them without doubt when they name me, and through them I will speak of a glory that could be. Like a rare gem, they will seldom appear, but when that happens, have no fear. They are the way and the light, and at their side you will prosper and take flight. Fetch your sexton and tighten your saddle, and let us ride high and fast on a flaming paddle. For bound to this dot your history spins, but now opens the big black, and a new story begins. The time has come that I reveal my game, that the true believer will never be the same. I am the spirit within you, the father of belief. So listen closely as I free you to find your relief. Upon an ancient coin a wager is tended most rare, that all human posterity shall be at last laid bare. For once in an age there is a minting to behold, and it bears an engraving, a story to be told. The words of the mark are naive and weak, so glimpse now the truth, and let the demon speak. The Evolutionary Origin of Belief. Section 1. At its most fundamental level, belief is about the sacred and the profane. The central hypothesis of this framework is that in deep human evolutionary history, belief evolved as a mechanism to protect individuals from their own intellect, specifically from the lethal consequences of intelligent reasoning in the absence of sufficient experience or evidence. The parable of the child and the tiger. Consider a highly intelligent child whose family teaches him never to enter a field of rustling grass, because rustling grass is the sound of demons that will kill him. The child, being intelligent, correctly identifies that the rustling correlates with wind and other mundane causes. Unaware of predators, because he has not lived long enough to accumulate that knowledge, he enters the field without fear. He is eaten by a tiger. This is the core paradox. The child's intelligence led him to correctly reject a false explanation while lacking the experiential base to generate the correct one. Belief, specifically the sacred prohibition, do not enter the rustling field, bridges that gap by making the behavioral constraint binding independent of understanding. The belief does not need to be true. It needs to be reliably action-guiding in context where accurate causal reasoning is unavailable or dangerous to attempt. The co-evolutionary lock. From this paradox, two things must co-evolve together. The child must be pre-wired for credulity, not gullibility as a flaw, but receptivity to authoritative prohibition as an adaptive trait. Natural selection would favor children who do not demand evidence before complying with survival critical rules, because the evidence gathering process in many ancestral environments was lethal. The elders must be pre-wired to teach without evidence. They cannot explain predation pressure from large felids. They have only pattern recognition accumulated across generations, wrapped in whatever explanatory framework their culture has available. Demons is as good as anything, because the content of the belief is less important than its behavioral binding power. This creates a co-evolutionary lock. Childhood credulity and authoritative belief transmission had to evolve together, each selecting for the other. Neither works without the other. Belief is not a passenger that hitched a ride on intelligence. It is load-bearing infrastructure. Why the two halves could not evolve independently. The lock requires a more precise mechanical explanation than co-occurrence alone provides. The feral protection system, the fight, flight, freeze, and feed responses mediated by structures such as the amygdala, had been under selection pressure for an incomparably longer period than any nascent intelligence. By the time intelligence began to emerge as a survival-relevant trait, the feral system was not a peer. It was a deeply entrenched incumbent with millions of years of refinement behind it. Intelligence could not simply displace it, because displacing it would have been immediately lethal. An organism that suspended feral threat responses in order to reason through a predator encounter did not survive to pass on that tendency. For intelligence to be selected for at all, it had to deliver survival value without displacing the feral system, which meant it had to negotiate. The feral system required representation in the cognitive output. What the brain actually does, understood this way, is take the raw impulses generated by the feral architecture, which are by definition emotional signals, and construct an intellectual framework around them. That framework gives the impulses cognitive expression, allowing them to participate in decision-making alongside reason, rather than being overridden by it. That constructed framework is what we call belief. Belief is not a failure of intelligence. It is the price intelligence paid for being selected for in the first place. The co-evolutionary lock is not merely that both systems were present simultaneously. It is that neither could have been selected for without the other, because intelligence without feral representation was lethal, and feral response without any cognitive mediation could not produce the behavioral complexity that intelligence enables. The belief system is what handles that negotiation. It always has been. And this also explains why the lock persists long after intelligence has developed sufficiently to sustain technology across generations. Evolution operates on timescales that technological advancement does not. The feral system's depth of selection, measured in millions of years, is not undone by thousands of years of civilization, let alone decades of scientific process. The negotiation continues because the underlying architecture that requires it has not changed. The belief system evolves in content while remaining structurally identical in function. It is still the cognitive framework that gives feral impulses intellectual representation. Higher intelligence does not dissolve this arrangement, it elaborates it. The demon does not get left behind as the intellect advances. It gets a more sophisticated wardrobe. The universality argument does not depend on Darwin. The generalization of this argument to alien civilizations does not require that those civilizations evolved by natural selection as understood in Earth biology. It requires only three conditions, each of which appears to be a logical prerequisite for intelligence itself, rather than a feature specific to terrestrial life. First, a recording mechanism. Some material substrate that stores responses to environmental events across time and transmits them forward. Genes are the Earth implementation, but the specific medium is irrelevant. What matters is that the record persists, accumulates, and is available to subsequent generations of the organism. Second, directionality. The recording is not neutral. Some stored responses are retained preferentially based on survival outcomes. We call this natural selection, but the label is Earth-specific. The logical structure, differential retention of responses based on their consequences, is what the argument requires, and it is difficult to conceive of intelligence arising in the absence of some such filtering mechanism. Third, depth of record. The recording has been running long enough across sufficient iterations of selection pressure that the protective response system is vastly more developed than any newly emergent cognitive capacity at the moment that cognitive capacity first appears. Given these three conditions, the negotiation argument follows for any intelligent organism anywhere. Any intelligence that arises will be newer than the protection system it arises alongside. It will have to negotiate for survival value without displacing that system. Belief, as the intellectual framework constructed around feral impulses to give them cognitive representation, is the universal output of that negotiation, regardless of the alien's biochemistry, neurology, or the specific mechanism by which its history is recorded and filtered. The Fermi generalization is not borrowing from Darwin. It is borrowing from something more fundamental. The logic of any system that records and differentially retains responses to survive in a dangerous environment over deep time. That logic appears to be a prerequisite for intelligence itself. Which means the demon, or something functionally identical to it, is almost certainly not unique to Earth. Part 2. Feral technological agency versus rational technological agency. As human society and technology development, a critical problem emerges. The framework distinguishes two fundamentally different modes of technological deployment. Feral technological agency, technology deployed in service of belief-driven goals where the motivating framework is sacred, profane, good, evil, or otherwise rooted in the belief circuitry rather than evidence. The technology itself may be sophisticated, but it is being aimed by a pre-scientific targeting system. The word feral is precise. Not broken or malfunctioning, but released from rational constraint. Like a domesticated animal gone feral, FTA retains full capability, but has lost the governing framework that made it safe. Rational technological agency deployed in service of goals derived from reason and evidence, where both the means and the ends are subject to empirical revision. The difference between FTA and RTA is not capability. It is the epistemological origin of the objective. If the ancestral environment FTA was relatively low stakes, the mismatch between belief, framework, and reality had bounded consequences because the technological leverage available was limited. But as technological capability scales, FTA becomes exponentially more dangerous. The belief circuitry remains essentially unchanged, generating the same sacred, profane distinctions, the same certainty without evidence, the same resistance to empirical challenge, but now operating the controls of industrial, nuclear, biological, and informational systems. The demon has the same face. The weapons are incomparably larger. So we get to the title here, guys. The Demon with 1,000 Faces is a borrowing or adoption of Campbell's The Hero with 1,000 Faces, in which he argued that really at bottom, all the heroes in literature and movies and so on really share certain core features. And so in a way, they're all the same hero. Well, it's the same way with belief. Beliefs have all different kinds of manifestations, they have different beliefs out there, but they have a common core. And that common core is defining the sacred and the profane, proselytizing for conversion, and manipulation for proselytizing. So we'll talk about that more later. Part 3. The demon with 1,000 faces. The demon is the belief circuitry itself, the ancient co-evolved mechanism that was once adaptive. It has 1,000 faces because belief, untethered from evidence, is generative without constraint. Any culture, tribe, nation, or ideology can produce its own sacred profane framework, its own demons and angels, its own categorical prohibitions and imperatives. Because none of them are anchored to reality, there is no limiting principle. The result is an essentially unlimited proliferation of mutually incompatible belief systems, each convinced of its own sacred correctness. The critical danger is not any specific belief system. It is the structural condition. Thousands of FTA systems operating simultaneously, each wielding escalating technological capability, each immune to empirical correction by design, and each potentially in direct conflict with the others. RTA systems can, in principle, negotiate because they share a common arbiter, evidence. If two RT actors disagree, there is a method for resolution. FTA systems have no such arbiter. When two FTA systems conflict, the only resolution mechanisms are dominance, exhaustion, or examination, because neither side can appeal to evidence to resolve the dispute. The belief circuitry was designed to be evidence resistant. So circling back to the Fermi paradox that we alluded to earlier. It's part 4, why the universe is silent. I think the more you think about this, the more obviously this is going to, or the more obvious this will become. And it will be a natural extension of this whole idea. This framework offers a novel and mechanistic resolution to the Fermi paradox. The standard formulations ask, where are they? And generate answers involving rare earth hypotheses, the great filter, self-destruction through warfare, or environmental collapse, etc. These are external constraints. This framework proposes an endogenous and structural answer. And I would argue more parsimonious, but we'll get to that too. The same coevolutionary coupling that produces intelligence capable of developing interstellar technology also produces the belief circuitry that, at sufficient technological scale, generates so many competing FTA systems that the civilization destroys itself, or at minimum never achieves the sustained rational cooperation that interstellar travel would require. We can say this in a more general way without talking about destruction and all that. As technological agency advances, what it means is that the life, whatever it is, has a greater energy capacity. In other words, it can command and apply greater and greater amounts of energy, and I would say rates of energy release, which is power, that continues to increase. And if they're all in opposition, it will be inherently destructive. If all of this power is being applied in contrary ways, it will be destructive. It won't be constructive. So we can generalize beyond, the concept even of warfare or just civilizational destruction. It's more fundamental even than that. So the Great Filter is not an asteroid, a pandemic, or a nuclear war specifically. It is the structural incompatibility between the belief circuitry and the technological threshold required for interstellar travel. A civilization must survive its own FTA long enough and completely enough to develop RTA-dominant civilization. And the demon with 1,000 faces makes that extraordinarily unlikely. So here we arrive at the universal generalization now. Critically, this is not Earth-specific or human-specific. The claim generalizes to any intelligence that arises through selection anywhere in the universe. Selection in a dangerous environment will always favor rapid behavioral constraint over slow rational evaluation. Credulity to authoritative prohibition in juveniles, and sacred profane frameworks that are evidence-resistant by design. These are not human quirks, they are convergent solutions to the universal problem of survival under uncertainty with insufficient information. Therefore, as long as some form of selection is at play for all life in the universe, the coevolution of intelligence and belief is a law-like consequence of that selection itself. The silence of the universe is not a mystery or a statistical anomaly. It is the expected output of selection as a universal law applied to the development of intelligence. Most people, at a very high percentage, will be believers, because this was strongly selected for. No matter how high the intellect, they will merely use that intellect to validate or attempt to validate their own beliefs, which are driven by their own feral nature. High intelligence deployed in service of belief circuitry produces the most sophisticated and dangerous form of FTA, because that intelligence is fully occupied constructing elaborate justifications for predetermined conclusions, identifying and neutralizing rational challenges, and building more powerful technology in service of feral objectives. This is the application of ever-increasing technology on the basis of utter nonsense. The method. Section 5, using intellect to defeat itself. So this is one way potentially out of this existential loop. We don't know if it'll work or not, but I can tell you it has worked well for me. So the good news is that today belief is entirely unnecessary, because the scientific body of knowledge is large enough and broad enough to use as a reference to make consequential decisions without belief. The placeholder has been superseded. The question becomes, how do individuals escape the feral architecture? The method uses the intellect to defeat itself. Its foundation rests on a key insight. Whatever conclusion makes us feel better is the belief we will construct. This is inherently part of, it is a natural result of a feral emotional-based system. So that emotional comfort is the fingerprint of the feral mind, and crucially, it is self-betraying. We do not need to be free of the feral circuitry to detect it. We only need sufficient self-awareness to notice the emotional signal, which is something everyone is capable of feeling. The iterative falsification protocol. The goal of this protocol is to identify the hypothesis most likely to be correct by exhausting the field of candidates through adversarial testing, beginning with the most uncomfortable and working toward the least. The comfortable hypothesis is consulted only as a reference point. It informs the construction of uncomfortable alternatives, but is never itself the object of pursuit. The feral mind's preferred conclusion is the starting map, not the destination. Step 1. Identify the hypothesis that produces the strongest emotional discomfort, the conclusion that feels the worst to complicate, the darkest humor imaginable, is another way of saying it. This is the correct place to begin. The feral mind has invested the least effort defending against the most uncomfortable conclusion, because it never expected you to go there voluntarily. It's just not wired that way. The defenses are weakest precisely where the discomfort is greatest. Step 2. Attempt to falsify that uncomfortable hypothesis using all available evidence and counter-argument. That is the scientific body of knowledge and the scientific method. Subject it to maximum adversarial pressure. If it is successfully falsified, discard it entirely and move to the next most emotionally uncomfortable hypothesis remaining. If it cannot be falsified, place it in the likely candidates bucket and continue. Do not stop. The process does not terminate on a single survivor. Every hypothesis must be tested. Step 3. Move to the next most emotionally uncomfortable hypothesis remaining and repeat the falsification attempt. Continue the sequence from most to least emotionally repugnant, until every hypothesis has been either discarded or placed in the likely candidates bucket. The process is exhaustive, not opportunistic. It does not end when the first unfalsifiable hypothesis is found. Step 4. Once the hypotheses have been processed, apply Occam's razor to the likely candidates bucket. The correct hypothesis is the one that requires the fewest number of assumptions while carrying the greatest explanatory power. That is the most probable conclusion. This second-order rational act is what distinguishes the protocol from mere discomfort seeking. The final selection is made on parsimony and explanatory reach, not on emotional signal alone. Step 5. If Occam's razor produces a tie, 2 or more hypotheses of equal required assumptions and explanatory power, choose the most emotionally uncomfortable among the tied candidates. The feral mind has no legitimate claim on the selection at this stage, and the tiebreaker is specifically designed to deny it one. The demon gets no vote in a tie. The protocol never produces certainty. It produces the least feral conclusion currently survivable under maximal adversarial testing. It is also immune to its own dogmatization. The emotional comfort signal will eventually attach to the method itself, at which point the protocol demands you attempt to falsify the method. The demon with 1,000 faces cannot wear this particular face for long without being detected. An important point here to make, guys, is when we say the protocol never produces certainty, there seems to be a common misunderstanding that I just want to address here in case you're thinking this. But the scientific method, the scientific body of knowledge, none of that is certain. There is no certainty in this universe. It doesn't work that way. What there are probabilities and uncertainties. That's all there is. What we are talking about here is the hypothesis most likely to be the correct one, which is the best you can possibly do. You cannot do any better than that. So I just want to be clear about that. We're not talking about certainty here at all. In fact, we're arguing that certainty is not achievable in its entirety. So I just want to clarify that in case that's confusing. Warning: the selection of the initial hypothesis must be made on the basis of emotional repugnance alone. If you find yourself using reason or evidence to identify which hypothesis to test first, rationalizing your way to a conclusion that feels unfavorable, rather than simply following the raw signal of maximum discomfort, you are not executing this profile. You are allowing the feral architecture to govern the selection phase under the guise of rationality, which is precisely the error this method is designed to circumvent. Reason and evidence belong exclusively to the falsification phase. Emotion belongs exclusively to the selection phase. Mixing them inverts the method and defeats its purpose. Empirical validation. This protocol is not armchair philosophy. It has been applied repeatedly to real analytical problems, including complex cold case investigations, that's true crime, requiring the evaluation of competing theories against incomplete and contested evidence, and has produced a measurably higher rate of accurate conclusions than prior analytical approaches. Just a quick aside here, I will later introduce what I call the Goldilocks narrative, and it's a true crime thing, but you're going to see lots of cases that were analyzed before they had resolution, and their accuracy is pretty astounding. Their predictive ability is pretty astounding. So the improvement is not marginal. The pattern is consistent enough to constitute a methodological observation. When the full protocol is executed, without shortcutting the exhaustion step or allowing the feral architecture to govern hypothesis selection, the most probable conclusion is identified with substantially greater reliability than intuition, experience, or conventional evidence-first analysis alone would produce. The framework predicts exactly this result. The feral mind's primary function is to steer analysis away from the most uncomfortable conclusion. This is important to understand. The feral mind's primary function is to steer analysis away from the most uncomfortable conclusion. I can give you 1,000 examples. Let's just take life on Mars. What does everyone think right now? They think there was life there before, right? Why? Because it feels good. But is that really true? We could talk about that in another discussion. But I think I can show that it's actually less than likely, but that's another discussion. If that conclusion consistently survives falsification and consistently wins on parsimony, it means the feral architecture was actively concealing the most parsimonious explanation, and that the discomfort signal was tracking truth rather than obscuring. The accuracy improvement is not a coincidence. It is a confirmation that motivated reasoning was the dominant source of analytical error, and that the protocol systematically eliminates it. So here, guys, this is the personal origin of the framework. This actually is about my background, and I've often wondered why, if this is all true, then why am I seeing it and other people aren't? Because I have met only maybe 3 people in my life who share these views, and they were all mathematical physicists, which is weird. But if it's just 3-4 people, it's that, where is this coming from? And I realized at some point that it comes from living in a household where there's a lot of manipulation, very expert, very talented manipulation going on. Because manipulation is the hallmark of proselytizing and conversion. When you try to bring someone into a belief system, it almost always involves manipulation. And I can't stand manipulation. So I think I had a repugnance for belief from the very beginning. I never liked it. I never felt comfortable with it. And I was always suspicious of it. But let's go ahead and go through this. The personal origin of the framework. This insight into belief derives from an unhealthy background in which a highly manipulative parent expertly exploited the belief propagation mechanism at its most intimate scale. What that environment produced was an early and visceral education in how belief spreads, not through evidence, but through emotional pressure, social leverage, and the exploitation of the credulity selected for in exactly the way this framework describes. It's spread through manipulation. The important caveat. In the natural ancestral world, this configuration would be maladaptive and would not be selected for. A child who develops deep skepticism of authoritative belief transmission in an environment where tigers are real walks into the field. The trait does not propagate. He dies. Right? This configuration only becomes viable, let alone advantageous, in a specific condition. A technological civilization advanced enough that the immediate survival cost of belief skepticism is removed, but not yet so dominant by FTA that the insight becomes irrelevant. So I think this may be the reason why it's unusual. It's not like some kind of special ability or something. It's actually an unhealthy defect. It's not selected for, and it's not good. I think if you can combine that with a reasonable degree of intelligence, people could probably reach this conclusion on their own. This whole idea of the demon with 1,000 faces. The institutional solution, part 6. Project management and the what-how separation. Here's another good example of how belief is weaponized and used to control and manipulate people. Politics. So here we go. The problem of belief's grip on human decision-making was addressed empirically in the 1960s, when mathematicians working for NASA and the Apollo program developed what became known as project management, specifically Agile, but we'll get to that. Though not conceived as a philosophical intervention, project management contains within it a structural solution to the belief paradox. The requirements engineering split. Project management divides any mission into 2 distinct phases. So this is very important. The requirements phase defines the what. That is to say, the desired outcome, stated in clear, verifiable, falsifiable terms. The development or engineering phase defines the how, the expert implementation of that outcome. These phases are deliberately separated because conflating them produces failure. It opens the door for belief to enter the picture and for people to be manipulated. So everybody wants to be an expert in everything, and belief exploits that aggressively. What this system is basically saying, guys, high level, is, if you simply ask the citizens of a nation to simply, what do they want to see happen in the most generic sense, you're really asking a values question. What do they value, right? You're not saying anything about how. The how is best resolved by experts, and what they come up with is best adjudicated to confirm that it complies with the what. A good example is gun control. There's so many issues that in the United States politically are so divisive, yet when you actually bring it back to, when you take the belief out of it, all of a sudden everybody agrees. That's the funny part about it. If you think about the what, most people agree on almost all aspects of it. What they disagree with is the how. So let me continue. It'll be more clear as we go. This separation is directly applicable to the belief problem. Belief by its nature invites the believer to pretend they have more competence than they do. It entices them to become preoccupied with the how, to become mired in implementation debates for which they are not qualified. This is three-card Monty, guys. Precisely in order to distract them from examining the what. This is not accidental. The how is where feral identity, tribal loyalty, and sacred commitment are fully engaged. The what, if examined carefully and stated empirically, tends to produce broad consensus, because humans largely want the same things. The demon lives in the how. The requirements phase is demon repellent. So let's talk about the three-card Monty. What are we actually saying here? All right. The demon with 1,000 faces is essentially a master of three-card Monty. A confidence artist, right? That's what it is. Anyone who proselytizes beliefs, they're a confidence artist whether they realize it or not. The demon places 3 cards on the table and shows their faces to the believer. On 2 of those cards is the how, on 1 of them is the what. The demon flips them back over, moves them around, but cheats. All 3 are now the how. The believer always picks how, believing they are choosing freely, believing they are engaging with genuine options, believing 1 of those cards is the what. The game is structurally unwinnable. The what was never on the table. This is the fundamental exploit of belief. This is how it works, and how it pits people against each other, among other things. This explains why political and ideological debates feel endless and irresolvable, as well as other debates that involve what and how. It doesn't matter. It could be politics or anything. Both sides are picking from a table that contains only hows. They argue with genuine passion and genuine intelligence and make 0 progress, because the what that would allow resolution was never placed on the table by either dealer. The requirements phase is the act of flipping all 3 cards over simultaneously and demanding the what be identified and verified before any how is permitted. Deliberate exploitation. The dealers who know the game. Overlaid on the purely evolutionary account is a second phenomenon. Deliberate exploitation of the belief circuitry by actors who benefit from its perpetuation, what I alluded to earlier. These are the card dealers who know the game is rigged. Read oligarchy. Not because they consciously understand the evolutionary architecture, but because they have learned empirically that certain techniques reliably capture and direct human behavior. They are FTA operatives who have discovered that the belief circuitry is the most powerful control surface available for managing large populations. The 3-card Monty is their core technology because the believer consents to being deceived. They stepped up to the table voluntarily. They are trying their best. This produces a profound psychological trap. When outcomes are bad, the believer blames themselves for picking the wrong rather than recognizing the game was so structurally unwinnable. The dealer's culpability is perfectly concealed behind the believer's own agency. The manipulation is also self-reinforcing. Once a believer has invested identity, community, and meaning into a belief system, the cost of recognizing the deception becomes existential. So now, the proposed governance structure. The institutional solution maps project management onto governance. Citizens provide the what, the requirements. What outcomes do we want as a society? This is a legitimate democratic function that requires no technical expertise, only lived experience and stated values. Experts provide the how, the engineering phase. Given the requirements, what does evidence say is the most effective implementation? Again, evidence, the body of knowledge. A court examines the product of that process, verifying that the how actually delivers the what, and has not been corrupted by FTA creeping back into the implementation phase. In other words, the what is not creeping into the how in particular. The court would validate that that has not occurred. That would be their role. This is a separation of epistemological powers, parallel to the separation of governmental powers, but operating at the level of knowledge and method rather than authority. It does not ask believers to stop believing. It removes belief from the phases where it does the most damage, and simultaneously removes the control surface that deliberate manipulators exploit. You cannot run three-card Monty if the what must be publicly stated, empirically examined, and legally protected before any how is permitted onto the table. Part 7, Addendum. The open problem of dissemination. And that's what this is about, actually. The most significant unresolved challenge is dissemination. The framework identifies its own propagation problem precisely. The people most capable of understanding it are rare. I mentioned that a minute ago. It requires someone who is, from an evolutionary point, maladaptive, but who also has a reasonable or sufficient level of intelligence to process all of this. So they have a unusually rare connection or understanding of manipulation and the thorough mind in the context of manipulation. And they have the intelligence to formalize that. So, yeah. Acquiring influence requires operating within systems substantially dominated by FTA, and the primary tool for spreading ideas at scale, proselytizing, is itself a feral mechanism that this framework identifies as suspect. You cannot spread RTA using FTA methods without contaminating the message. But RTA methods do not scale the way FTA methods do, because they do not exploit the belief circuitry that makes mass persuasion possible. This may itself be a confirmation of the Fermi conclusion. The framework that could theoretically redirect civilization toward RTA is structurally disadvantaged in the very competition for minds that would be required to implement it. The mission is to find a way to get this framework in front of millions of people, at minimum to make it available without resorting to the feral propagation mechanisms that would corrupt it in transmission. This remains an open problem, and hey, solutions are actively sought. Section 8, a possible exit. And I think what we're really going to show here is that there's not one, but we're going to try to falsify this idea that there's no exit. Every solution previously proposed to the problem of dangerous belief has shared a fatal assumption that human beings can be persuaded to abandon belief through argument, evidence, or the demonstrated superiority of rational frameworks. Enlightenment rationalism made this assumption. Secular humanism made it. Liberal democracy made it. Each failed in the same way for the same reason. Belief is not primarily an intellectual commitment. It is a survival mechanism co-evolved with intelligence over hundreds of thousands of years, and survival mechanisms do not yield to argument. You cannot reason someone out of a position they did not reason themselves into. Every attempted solution that required conscious philosophical surrender by the believer has foundered on this rock without exception. This is why the problem has appeared unsolvable. Not because rational alternatives don't exist, but because the delivery mechanism for those alternatives has always required an act of will that the architecture of belief is specifically designed to prevent. What has changed for the first time in history of this problem is the emergence of a delivery mechanism that does not require that act of will at all. The value threshold suspension effect. Observation of human behavior across technological transitions reveals a consistent and underappreciated pattern. When a rational system delivers sufficiently tangible, immediate, and broadly distributed value, human beings suspend their operative belief frameworks in that domain, not through philosophical conversion, but through behavioral drift. The suspension is initially pragmatic, then habitual, then structural. The belief does not get defeated. It gets abandoned in practice, one domain at a time, as the rational alternative consistently outperforms it. The agricultural green revolution secularized rural populations across the developing world more effectively than any philosophical campaign ever had, because it made harvest predictable in ways that prayer demonstrably could not. When irrigation and fertilizer reliably produce food, the ritual propitiation of rain gods loses its functional grip. Not because anyone argued against it, but because the domain it occupied contracted. The smartphone reorganized human behavior at civilizational scale without requiring any philosophical commitment from its users whatsoever. People did not adopt it because they were persuaded that it was rational or created through a rational technological agency process, technological development. They adopted it because it worked, visibly and immediately, in their hands. The mechanism is not ideological, it is behavioral. And behavioral change, accumulated across enough domains and enough generations, produces the structural condition that philosophical argument alone never could. A population that has learned through repeated experience that rational systems deliver and belief systems do not. And now, what artificial intelligence adds to this? Prior technological waves displaced specific belief-dependent uncertainties: disease, famine, navigation, communication across distance. Each contraction of the domain of genuine uncertainty reduced the territory available to belief without ever threatening its core. Enough uncertainty always remained to sustain the framework. Artificial intelligence is categorically different in one critical respect. It does not merely displace specific uncertainties. It displaces the cognitive intermediary role that has anchored belief systems to power throughout recorded history. Priests, prophets, ideological authorities, and political messiahs have all derived their authority from the same source: the complexity gap between what ordinary people could reason through themselves and what the interpreter claimed to be access on their behalf. The interpreter's authority, religious, political, or ideological, has always depended on that gap remaining unbridgeable. A sufficiently capable and broadly accessible AI reasoning system narrows that gap in a way nothing previously has. It provides every individual with a direct, non-threatening, demonstrably useful reasoning partner available without institutional mediation. When people can reason through complex systems themselves, or with assistance that makes no claim to supernatural authority, the intermediary role that belief systems have always colonized begins to lose its functional necessity. Not through argument, through direct experience of the alternative. This is the first proposed exit from the demon's trap that does not require human beings to be wiser or more rational than they are. It requires only that the technology delivers, and that the delivery is broad enough, fast enough to be experienced directly, then promised abstractly. The condition that must hold. Intellectual honesty requires stating the bypass condition's dark mirror with equal precision, because the same mechanism runs in both directions. The value threshold suspension effect depends entirely on value actually being delivered, broadly, tangibly, and at sufficient speed to outcompete the disruption in technology the technology simultaneously produces. If artificial intelligence delivers transformative abundance to a narrow stratum while displacing the economic foundations of the majority, the suspension effect does not merely fail to activate, it reverses. Populations experiencing dislocation, loss of meaning, and material insecurity do not drift toward rationalism. They accelerate toward belief, because the demon feeds on exactly the anxiety and purposelessness that a failed or inequitable technological transition produces. Weimar Germany remains the definitive illustration. Rational liberal institutions failed to deliver the material security, and the resulting social anxiety was immediately metabolized into the most virulent and catastrophic belief-driven political movement of the modern era. The stakes of the AI transition are therefore not merely economic. They are civilizational, in exactly the sense this document has argued throughout. A broadly distributed transition that delivers tangible value widely enough to trigger the suspension effect at scale represents the first viable path past the filter. A narrowly captured transition that produces mass displacement before it produces mass abundance may represent the most efficient activation of the demon ever achieved, combining the reach of a global technology with the grievance of a global dispossession. The exit is real. The window is not guaranteed to remain open. All right, so the Fermi dimension to all of this. The Great Filter argument advanced earlier in this document posits that civilizations capable of developing dangerous belief systems at civilizational scale almost universally destroy themselves before achieving technological maturity to transcend them. The value threshold hypothesis suggests a specific mechanism by which this filter operates and why it is so lethal. The bypass condition, a technology that delivers value faster and more broadly than belief can regenerate resistance to it, is extraordinarily difficult to achieve. It requires not merely developing the technology, but distributing its value widely enough and quickly enough to trigger the suspension effect before the disruption it causes triggers the intensification effect. That is a narrow window. Most civilizations may never open it. Some may open it and fail to pass through it before it closes. We may be the first civilization in a position to attempt the passage with full awareness of what the attempt requires. This is not optimism. It is an engineering problem. And engineering problems, unlike problems of human nature, are in principle solvable. And section 9, the Luddite paradox. The exit hypothesis advanced in the preceding section rests on a condition that is more fragile than it first appears. The value threshold suspension effect assumes that demonstrated, tangible, broadly distributed value is sufficient to erode the functional grip of belief over time. The historical evidence supports this, but only within populations that remain in contact with the demonstrating system. It says nothing about populations that refuse contact on principle. This is the Luddite paradox, and it cuts deeper than the name suggests. The original Luddites were not irrational. They correctly identified that the technology being introduced would destroy their economic foundations and the social structures built on them. The resistance was a rational response to a real threat, expressed through the only framework available to them, which happened to be saturated with belief. The paradox is that the same belief architecture that makes populations resistant to rational argument also makes them resistant to rational demonstration. You cannot show someone the value of a system they have committed on sacred grounds never to engage with. The demonstration never reaches them. The suspension effect has no surface to act on. This is not a marginal concern. Every major technological transition in recorded history has produced a non-trivial population of principled non-participants, groups whose belief frameworks explicitly prohibit engagement with the new system, or whose identity is constituted by opposition to it. In most historical cases, these populations were eventually absorbed, marginalized, or overwhelmed by the sheer economic and military dominance of the adopting civilization. The Amish exist. They do not govern it. They do not govern. The math worked out. But the math worked out under a specific condition. The non-participating population remained small relative to the adopting one, and lacked the technological leverage to impose its framework on the majority by force. Neither of these conditions is guaranteed in the AI transition, and one of them is already in question. The problem of scale operates in two directions simultaneously. If the adopting population is sufficiently large, and the non-participating population sufficiently small, the transition proceeds and the Luddite enclave becomes a historical curiosity. But if the non-participating population is already at or near sufficient size, and in global terms the populations whose belief frameworks are structurally opposed to rational technological agency number in the billions, then the dynamic inverts. The non-participating population does not need to adopt the technology to exert force on the system. It needs only to reach a threshold of political, demographic, or kinetic leverage from which it can impose its framework on the adopting population, or deny the adopting population the conditions it needs to sustain the transition. This is where the paradox achieves its full depth. The AI transition, if it succeeds in the way exit hypothesis requires, will accelerate the productive and military capacity of adopting civilizations at a rate that has no historical precedent. That acceleration is the source of the exit hypothesis's optimism, but it is simultaneously the source of the Luddite paradox's most acute danger. A sufficiently large belief-driven population, watching the rational system demonstrate its dominance, does not necessarily drift toward adoption. It may instead accelerate toward the conclusion that the window for imposing its own framework by force is closing, and that the moment to act is now, before the capability gap becomes unbridgeable. The demonstration of rational superiority, in other words, may trigger exactly the eschatological urgency that makes belief-driven civilizations most dangerous. The printing press worked, and it produced a century and a half of religious warfare before the populations it disrupted exhausted themselves into something resembling equilibrium. The question of the Luddite paradox poses for the AI transition is whether the adopting civilization has a century and a half to spend, and whether the weapons available to the non-participating population during that period remain bounded enough to survive the transition intact. There is no clear resolution to this problem within the framework. The exit hypothesis identifies a genuine mechanism. The Luddite paradox identifies a genuine ceiling on that mechanism's reach. Together they define the actual shape of the problem, not a binary choice between the demon's persistence and its defeat, but a race condition, between the speed at which rational systems can deliver value broadly enough to trigger the suspension effect, and the speed at which non-participating populations can reach the leverage threshold from which they can reimpose FTA on the system as a whole. The universe may be silent not because civilizations failed to develop the technology, and not because they failed to distribute it. It may be silent because in the end, they could not distribute it fast enough. Further attempts at falsification are invited. Belief is a confidence trick. If you hold one, you are being manipulated and taken advantage of. Full stop. Don't be a mark. Yeah, these are some quotes I have. I don't read those, but you can pause and look at them if you want. But they're just ways in which I've sort of, illustrated some of these points. But that's it, guys. That's an introduction to what this channel is about. And this channel is going to involve a lot of practical applications of this to real-world problems. And we're going to go through it and we're going to see how this works. So I'm going to try to demonstrate the method. And one of the things I'm going to do is develop what I call the Goldilocks narrative, which I mentioned previously. We're going to use that in the domain of true crime. And we're going to do a whole lot of other things to demonstrate how we can manage belief. Look forward to seeing you on the next one. Talk to you soon.